Julia had always believed she knew her husband, Mark, better than anyone until the day she discovered his dark secret. What began as a small, innocent text message quickly unraveled into a web of lies, betrayal, and a hidden affair that would shatter everything she thought she knew about their marriage. As Julia delved deeper into the truth, she found herself standing at a crossroads. Could she forgive the man she had loved for so long? Or was it too late to save what remained of their family? Julia had always believed she was living the perfect life. She had the family she always dreamed of, a beautiful home on the outskirts of the city, and a husband who seemed to adore her. Mark was everything she had hoped for: a loving partner, a successful businessman, and an attentive father to their 2 children. They were the kind of couple that everyone else envied, always hosting dinner parties and taking family vacations that looked straight out of a magazine. It wasn't until their 10th wedding anniversary that Julia began to feel that something wasn't right. It started off as small, almost insignificant changes: Mark working late more frequently, disappearing for hours without any clear explanation. He'd always been dedicated to his career, but now it seemed as though he was becoming distant, even when he was at home. Julia tried to ignore it. After all, he was under a lot of pressure at work, and they had 2 children to care for. It made sense that his focus was elsewhere. But then the little things started adding up. Julia found herself questioning why he always had his phone with him, even when they were at dinner or watching a movie together. He used to leave it in another room, not even thinking about it, but now it was always within arm's reach. One night, after Mark had gone to bed, Julia was cleaning up the kitchen when she noticed a text message on his phone screen that he had left unlocked. It was a simple, seemingly harmless message: "Can't wait to see you tonight." But it wasn't from her. Julia's stomach dropped as she stared at the words. She'd never seen this name before, and the message wasn't the kind of thing you send to a spouse. Her heart raced. She wasn't the type of person to jump to conclusions, but something in the pit of her stomach told her this was no innocent misunderstanding. For the first time in their marriage, she felt betrayed, and the thought of confronting him filled her with dread. What if it was just a mistake? Or worse, what if this was the beginning of something she couldn't undo? Julia wrestled with herself for hours, unsure of what to do. Her mind screamed for answers, but fear kept her frozen in place. The next day, Mark was acting as if nothing was wrong, as though the message hadn't even crossed his mind. He kissed her goodbye as he left for work, and Julia couldn't help but feel like a stranger in her own life. She had trusted Mark completely. They had built everything together, and yet now she felt like everything was falling apart. It was as if she was living in a movie where the plot was turning darker with every passing moment. Determined to know the truth, Julia started watching Mark more closely. She paid attention to his schedule, his phone calls, even his subtle body language when he returned home from work. He seemed more distracted, more distant, but he wasn't outright dismissive. He still kissed her goodnight, still helped with the kids. On the surface, everything appeared normal, but Julia couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her gut told her to dig deeper, to find answers no matter the cost. The woman she was before this moment, the trusting wife, the happy mother, was slipping away, replaced by someone driven by the need for truth. Julia knew she couldn't rest until she uncovered what was hiding behind Mark's charming smile. As the days passed, Julia's unease grew. The text message was only the beginning, and now she couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was hiding something. She had to know the truth, even if it meant confronting the ugly reality she dreaded. She began to notice even more subtle signs: his frequent late nights at the office, which seemed to drag on longer than usual, and the way he'd often glance at his phone when it buzzed, then quickly pocket it as if trying to hide something. Mark had always been open with her, never the type to be secretive. But now there was a clear wall between them, and it was as if he thought she wouldn't notice. Julia started following him. At first it was a passing thought, a moment of doubt she pushed aside. But as she sat in the kitchen one night, watching him prepare for another late meeting, she couldn't ignore it anymore. He told her that he needed to finish a project and that it would take longer than usual. She could have stayed home, made dinner for the kids, and waited for him to return as she always did. But tonight something pushed her. She wasn't just the wife anymore, she was the investigator, and this was her moment to find out the truth. She knew he would never expect it. With a pounding heart, Julia quietly grabbed her coat, waited for him to leave, and then followed him in her car, staying far enough behind to avoid being seen. Her mind raced as she kept a steady distance. Mark didn't seem to be driving with any particular urgency. It was as if he was in no rush, taking his time as though he had nothing to hide. But every turn he made sent a chill down Julia's spine. She had no idea where he was headed, but she had a sinking feeling that it wasn't to the office. Eventually, Mark turned into a small, nondescript hotel parking lot. Julia's heart stopped for a moment as she parked a few spaces away. She sat there, staring at the building, the enormity of what was unfolding hitting her like a wave. He couldn't be. No, it couldn't be what she thought. But there was no other explanation. She watched as Mark parked his car and walked into the hotel, his movements casual, completely unaware that his wife was just yards away, watching him disappear into the building. The hours seemed to stretch on endlessly as Julia sat in the car, unsure of what to do next. Was she really going to wait here all night to see if Mark emerged? What would she do if he did? She felt like a fool for not confronting him immediately, but the reality of the situation was too overwhelming. This wasn't just an affair, this was everything she had known about their marriage being shattered. Finally, just as the sky began to darken, Julia saw Mark exit the hotel, accompanied by a woman she didn't recognize. She barely saw her face, but the two of them walked close together, laughing, their bodies leaning toward each other in a way that made Julia's stomach churn. Mark didn't even glance around, as if he were completely at ease. He wasn't sneaking around, wasn't trying to hide. He had no idea Julia was watching, no clue that his entire world was about to come crashing down. Julia stayed in the car for a long while, her mind in a haze. The image of Mark with another woman burned into her mind, replaying over and over again. It wasn't just a single mistake, this was deliberate. She had been living a lie. And the anger that bubbled up inside her was something she had never felt before. It wasn't just betrayal, it was the realization that her entire life had been a carefully constructed illusion, and now the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. She had trusted him completely, and now that trust had been shattered. When Mark finally drove off, Julia waited a few moments before starting her car and heading home, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had seen. There was no going back now. She couldn't pretend that everything was fine, that Mark was the man she had married. The truth had come to light, and now she had to decide what to do with it. The days following her discovery were the longest of Julia's life. She couldn't escape the images of Mark and the woman from the hotel. They had seemed so carefree, so natural together, and the thought that he had been living this double life for so long made her feel sick. Julia spent every waking moment replaying the scene over and over in her mind. Each time it felt like a fresh wound. Her entire world had been upended. She felt as if she no longer knew the man she had spent the last decade with. The trust she had placed in him seemed utterly meaningless now. Julia couldn't shake the need to know more. She had seen Mark in the hotel with another woman, but she didn't know who she was, what she meant to him, or how deep this affair had gone. Was it just a fling, or was there something more serious? Mark had always been careful, hiding his phone, keeping his distance when it came to certain topics, but now it was as if everything about their life together was a lie. She needed to find answers. After a few sleepless nights, Julia decided to take a more direct approach. She had to find out who this woman was, and what better way to do that than to confront her. It wasn't an easy decision. The thought of tracking down one of Mark's lovers was terrifying. It wasn't just about confronting Mark anymore, it was about facing the reality of their marriage, the lies and the deep betrayal. But Julia's need for closure, for understanding, outweighed her fear. She couldn't keep living in this limbo. One afternoon, after dropping the kids off at school, Julia decided to go to the local gym that Mark had mentioned several times. She had never been there herself, but Mark had spoken about it often, about the people he worked with, and the programs they offered. She did a quick search online and found out that a woman named Samantha was one of the trainers at the gym. The name seemed familiar, but Julia wasn't sure. All she knew was that Samantha might be the key to unraveling the truth. Julia hesitated outside the gym, her nerves almost paralyzing her. What if Samantha was just a woman Mark worked with? What if she was innocent in all of this? But Julia couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her gut. She had to do it. She took a deep breath and walked inside. The gym was busy with people working out, but Julia's eyes scanned the room quickly. She spotted Samantha almost immediately, a tall, athletic woman with blonde hair tied back in a ponytail. Julia walked up to the front desk, her heart racing. She had no plan, no script for what she was about to do. She just knew that she couldn't leave until she had answers. Samantha greeted her with a friendly smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice warm and welcoming. Julia's voice was shaky as she spoke, but she forced the words out. "I need to talk to you. About Mark." The mention of his name caused Samantha's smile to falter, just for a moment, but it was enough for Julia to know that something was off. Samantha's expression softened, and she nodded. "Sure, let's talk." She led Julia to a quieter corner of the gym. As they sat down, Julia wasted no time. She asked the question that had been haunting her: "How long have you and Mark been seeing each other?" Samantha's face turned pale, and for a moment Julia thought she might deny it, or get angry, or even tell her she was mistaken. But instead, Samantha's eyes filled with a mix of sadness and guilt. "I didn't know about you at first," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought he was single. He told me that he was." Julia's blood ran cold. He told her he was single. Mark had been lying to both of them. But Samantha's next words hit Julia like a physical blow. "We've been seeing each other for over a year now," Samantha continued. "He promised me so many things. He said he was going to leave his wife for me, that we'd have a life together." Julia fought to keep her composure, but the anger inside her surged. How many times had Mark told her he loved her, promised her everything, while secretly telling another woman the same thing? How many lies had he woven into the fabric of their marriage? How many promises had he broken? The reality of what was happening hit her with the full weight of its cruelty. Samantha continued to speak, but Julia wasn't really listening anymore. Her mind was racing with the new information. Mark had been living a lie, not just with Samantha, but with her. She wasn't the only one he'd been deceiving. He had built an entire secret life, one that Julia had never suspected, one that had been hidden beneath layers of charm and manipulation. She didn't know whether to feel pity for Samantha or hate her for being a part of the betrayal. But as Julia left the gym, her head was spinning with new revelations. The truth, as painful as it was, had set her on a path she couldn't ignore. She couldn't unsee what she now knew, and there was no going back. Julia spent the next few days in a haze of anger and disbelief. The confrontation with Samantha had given her the clarity she had been desperately seeking, but it also confirmed what she had feared the most. Mark wasn't just having a casual affair, he was deeply involved in a lie that spanned over a year. He had promised this woman the world, promising things he had never said to her, all while keeping his family in the dark. Every moment with Mark felt like a lie now. How many times had he kissed her goodbye and told her he loved her, all the while seeing another woman? Julia felt a wave of disgust and betrayal that made her stomach churn. The trust they had built over the years was now in tatters, and the reality was too much to bear. She thought about the years they had spent together, the family vacations, the dinners, the quiet nights at home. Were those moments ever real? Or had they always been part of the illusion he had so carefully constructed? Despite the growing anger inside her, Julia couldn't ignore the feeling that she had to confront Mark. She couldn't let him continue living this double life without paying the price. She needed to make him see the destruction his actions had caused, not just to her, but to their entire family. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine while he continued his affair with Samantha. Julia knew that if she didn't act now, she would be forced to live with the unbearable knowledge of what was happening behind her back. The decision to confront him wasn't easy. Mark had been her partner for so long, the father of her children, the man she thought she knew. But now she saw him through a different lens, a man capable of betraying her trust in ways she never imagined. Her heart raced as she considered what would happen when she confronted him. Would he lie again? Would he beg for forgiveness, pretending that it was all a mistake? Or would he admit the truth and face the consequences of his actions? Julia didn't know what she expected, but she knew that she couldn't keep living in this suffocating uncertainty. The plan was simple. She would wait until he returned from work, when he was most relaxed, unsuspecting. She had to do this on her terms, to catch him off guard. She had gathered every piece of evidence she could: texts, emails, even the address book with the names of other women. She wasn't going to let him talk his way out of it. She had already made up her mind. He would confess, and they would face the truth together. That evening, as Mark came home, Julia could feel the tension building in her chest. He walked in, greeted her with a kiss on the cheek, and started talking about his day. She tried to listen, but every word he spoke sounded hollow. She couldn't pretend anymore. The man standing in front of her was not the man she had married. The man she had loved had disappeared behind a web of lies, and it was time to expose him for who he really was. She took a deep breath and, without wasting another second, dropped the bombshell. "I know about Samantha," she said, her voice steady but filled with years of hurt. Mark froze, his face draining of color. The shock was evident in his eyes, but it quickly gave way to a defensive anger. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice rising. But Julia wasn't backing down. She laid out everything, every detail she had uncovered, the hours she had spent researching his secret life. She told him about the hotel, the texts, the evidence she had gathered. She didn't need to wait for him to explain. She already knew the truth. Mark's reactions were a mix of disbelief, guilt, and then finally anger. He tried to deny it at first, telling her she was mistaken, that it was all a misunderstanding. But Julia wasn't fooled. She had seen the proof with her own eyes. She didn't need his lies anymore. Her heart pounded as she confronted him with the painful reality. This wasn't just about a mistake. This was about years of lies and deceit, and now she had to face the fallout. For a moment, Mark stood there in stunned silence. Then, as if realizing the depth of what he had done, he crumbled. His face flushed with regret, and he muttered apologies, but they meant nothing now. Julia had already seen the real Mark, the man who had betrayed her, the man who had destroyed their family, and no amount of apologies could fix the damage that had been done. As he begged for her forgiveness, something shifted inside Julia. The anger she had felt moments before began to turn into something else. It wasn't pity, but a realization that she was no longer that woman, the woman who had trusted, who had loved without question. Julia wasn't going to let him control the narrative anymore. This wasn't just about their marriage. This was about her self-respect, and reclaiming her life. But she wasn't ready to make any decisions yet. Not tonight. Tonight, all she could do was stand there absorbing the truth that her life, everything she had built with Mark, had crumbled in the wake of his betrayal. And now she had to figure out what came next. The following days felt like a blur. After Mark's confession, the house seemed too quiet, too still. Julia barely knew what to do with herself. She had confronted him, forced the truth into the open, but now the weight of it all felt suffocating. She hadn't expected it to be easy, but the emotional toll was far more than she anticipated. Every time she looked at Mark, all she could see was the man who had broken her heart, who had deceived her for so long. The love she had once felt for him now felt like a distant memory, something fragile and shattered. Mark was desperate to fix things. He followed her around the house, apologizing, trying to explain himself. He told her that his affair with Samantha had started out innocently, that it was a mistake, that he had never meant for it to get this far. But Julia wasn't listening anymore. She had heard it all before, the excuses, the justifications. What hurt the most wasn't the affair itself. It was the betrayal of trust, the realization that everything they had shared was now tainted. Mark had been living a double life, and that was something Julia couldn't ignore. He had built a wall between them, and no matter how many times he said, "I'm sorry," it didn't erase the damage. The hardest part was dealing with the children. They didn't know what had happened, of course. They were too young to understand the complexities of adult relationships, too innocent to grasp the gravity of the situation. Julia had always tried to shield them from conflict, but now she couldn't escape the reality of what their father had done. Every time she saw their smiling faces, it was like a punch to the gut. How could she protect them from the hurt that was now inevitable? Mark's actions had stained everything, and she wasn't sure if their family could ever be the same again. Julia's mind raced as she went through the motions of daily life, getting the kids to school, preparing meals, making small talk with neighbors. But beneath it all, she was struggling. The house felt like a prison, a reminder of everything she had lost. She knew she needed space, time to figure out what she wanted. But Mark wasn't giving her that. He was there, always there, begging for her to forgive him, to give him another chance. But forgiveness didn't come easily. How could she forgive him when every part of her screamed that he didn't deserve it? Julia wasn't a vindictive person. She didn't want revenge. She just wanted the truth to be acknowledged and the pain to stop. But Mark seemed oblivious to how deep the wounds ran. Every apology he offered felt empty, as if he couldn't truly grasp the extent of what he had done. One night, as Julia sat alone in their bedroom, she stared at their wedding photos on the wall. There they were, two people who had once promised to love and honor each other forever. How had it all gone so wrong? She didn't know who to blame anymore. Was it Mark for betraying her, or was it her own blind trust that had allowed this to happen in the first place? There were no easy answers, no simple solutions. Julia had always prided herself on being strong, independent. But now, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. The woman who had built a life with Mark had vanished, replaced by someone scarred and uncertain. She needed time to grieve, time to think, and time to decide what her future looked like. It was a decision that couldn't be rushed, no matter how much Mark begged. Days turned into weeks, and Julia began to distance herself from Mark, not out of spite, but because she needed the space to find herself again. She stopped responding to his every plea for forgiveness and started taking time for herself. She visited friends she hadn't seen in years, found moments of peace with her children, and slowly she began to rebuild the part of herself that had been lost in the whirlwind of betrayal. Eventually, the time came when Julia knew she had to make a choice. Could she ever forgive Mark? Could she live with the hurt, knowing he had broken her heart? Or would she leave him, start over, and rebuild her life on her own terms? It wasn't an easy decision, and Julia knew it would take time. But as she sat in the quiet of her home, thinking of all the possibilities, one thing became clear: she wasn't the same person who had once trusted Mark with her heart. And no matter what came next, she would have to learn how to trust herself again.